Hello everyone, Mr. B here. So you might have seen that we skipped chapter 12, which happens to do with social psychology, because there's an entire college class that covers that. But I am going to be making a video later. But for the sake of the exam that's coming up, we're going straight to chapter 13, which has to do with psychological disorders. And if we look at the modules that we will be covering today, which is just one of the modules, but it's a big one, there's quite a few questions or things that we're going to be covering that you will need to know for the exam. So let's get right into it. And so as I mentioned, chapter 13 has to do with psychological disorders. And the very first thing, before we can even get into psychological disorders, is we need to understand what it means when we talk about someone's behavior being abnormal or being not normal. And so there are certain criteria as far as we are concerned that classifies what we see as abnormal behavior. And the very first one is unusualness. So behavior that's not usual. So behavior can be unusual, but not abnormal. So the thing to take away from this, and is very crucial to remember for the exam, is that just because somebody acts unusual, so if they don't act the way, other people act, that does not make them abnormal. It is not enough criteria on its own to count. Other criteria for abnormal behavior is social deviance. And so if your behavior goes against the social norms, essentially. And what's interesting about this is in certain environments and certain situations within a certain society, sometimes the way that you behave is acceptable and the way that you behave is unacceptable. So the example is, how you would act in church versus how you would act with your friends. The majority of the time we know how to behave, but when you see people behaving the way they shouldn't in certain situations, that could be an abnormal behavior. Another one is emotional distress. This one is a huge one. So things like anxiety or depression, we start to see abnormal behavior if it, causes you distress, if it makes you uncomfortable, and if it's inappropriate, excessive, or prolonged. This is also huge because if, something horrible has happened in someone's life and they get upset about it, that's not abnormal behavior. That's just the way that we naturally respond to certain situations. But if it's inappropriate, if you're getting upset over things that people usually don't get upset over, and if it seems to be out of proportion of how much you should be displaying and for a longer amount of time, that is when it could then be seen as abnormal behavior. Another one is maladaptive behavior. So again, if it's causing that distress, if it's self-defeating, so, if you're constantly putting yourself down, if it can hurt your health, your social life, or your occupation, if it affects your ability to work, that could be part of the criteria for abnormal behavior. Another huge one is dangerousness, whether it's to yourself or others. And then the last one, where there is also a question on the exam about this, is a faulty perception or interpretations of reality. An example of this is, again, if you are hallucinating or if you have delusions. So if you're hearing voices that are demeaning you or making you feel bad, that would be an example of a faulty perception or interpretation of reality. And so this just shows the criteria for classifying abnormal behavior. And again, the thing to take home is that it's not if you just tick one box, boom, you have abnormal behavior. It's not that simple. And just because someone might, fill some of these boxes, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's abnormal. Because another thing to take into consideration is the culture. Because we see that what's considered normal and what's considered not normal or abnormal also varies by culture. One big example is, as you see here, tattoos. In certain cultures, especially like in tribes, it's expected that you are going to get tattoos. And so that's considered normal. Whereas there are other areas where it's considered, more taboo. You don't see as many, or, people are frowned upon for having tattoos in certain areas. And so it just shows that how we define what's normal also varies within a single culture. So there's different models when it comes to abnormal behavior. We went over the criteria, but then when we're kind of more describing what's going on, why do we see these abnormal behaviors, there's all sorts of models. The first one is the medical model, which we are going to go into in just a little bit, but that's looking at more the physical or biological explanation, so what's going on physically. All the rest are what we see as those psychological models, and there's quite a few that we're going to be going over. A few, we start with psychodynamic, and if you recall, that's Freud. This is the first one, because there's a few of the models you'll need to know for the exam. And Freud believed that abnormal behavior was an outward expression of inner turmoil. And I'm actually going to... Oh, wait, that's right. You guys can't see myself. And so I would focus on that, this outward expression of inner turmoil. Because, again, Freud had this whole idea of the unconscious mind. It was things in the back of our mind that affected our behavior. Then we have the behavioral one, which you also need to know for the exam. And the thing to remember about this is that the whole idea of the behaviorist view is that it's a learned behavior. And so the behavioral model for abnormal behavior says the exact same thing. We learned to behave in an unusual way. The example it gives right here is little Albert, who was taught to fear white rats. And so it was an acquired fear. It was an abnormal behavior. By the end of the experiment, little Albert was afraid of something that most people are not. It was abnormal in a sense. So that's the behavioral view. Then we have the humanistic. And again, humanistic is all about bringing about your best possible self. And so they believe that abnormal behavior is when you stray from that, when you have these roadblocks, when you become detached from your true self, or you have this distorted image of who you are and what you want to be. And then the last one, at least on this slide, is the cognitive model. And if you recall, the cognitive perspective is all about, how you're thinking, how you're reasoning. And so the idea is that this abnormal behavior is coming from irrational or distorted thinking. So the way that you are thinking about something affects the way that you behave about it. So like the example it gives is magnifying or exaggerating consequences of negative events. So thinking, it's the end of the world because, I broke my nail. Something like that. We then also have the sociocultural model. And this says that there are things within our society, within our culture, that affects the prevalence of abnormal behavior. So things like social class, poverty, ethnic and cultural background, racial, gender discrimination. And what you will need to know for the exam is there is some evidence that points towards this, because it's found there is a higher prevalence in anxiety and depression of those that are living in poverty. And so we do see that certain situations in our society, certain things within our culture, can also affect that prevalence of abnormal behavior. Then we have the biopsychosocial model, which I know you can't quite see all the title. There we go. There we go. So the biopsychosocial model, the thing to know about this is that it's the most comprehensive model. And the reason why it's the most comprehensive is it's a combination of 3 different models. So the biological, which again we're going to talk about a little bit more, but it's kind of, again, like physical health, genetic vulnerability, drug effects. You then have the social, which we've talked about a little bit, so your peers, family circumstances, and then psychological. So again, all the ones that we've kind of talked about. You have coping skills, social skills, family relationships, self-esteem, mental health, and all these things come together to then explain abnormal behavior. So unlike the other models that say it's kind of just this way, it's just the learned behavior, it's just your cognition, it's just your culture, this is saying that it's a combination of those things. And so of course that would be the most comprehensive. Then we get into something known as the diathesis stress model. And you also need to know this for the exam. And this is the whole idea that you have a predisposition or vulnerability to a certain psychological disorder. Whether it's inherited, whether it's something about your personality that makes you more prone to certain disorders. And the whole idea is you have, this predisposition, and then there's some sort of stress, something that happens in the environment. Whether, it's prenatal trauma, so, something that happens before you're even born when you're developing, which we've talked about before. Childhood sexual or physical abuse, family conflict, significant life changes. So any of those things that cause a tremendous amount of stress then bring out that psychological disorder. So the whole idea is that there's a lot of people out there that have this predisposition for certain psychological disorders, but if there isn't that environmental stressor, it never really comes out or develops. So that's the diathesis stress model. The thing to take away from this is that a diathesis is this predisposed or vulnerability to a disorder, whether, again, it's genetics, personality, or anything like that. So now we're actually getting into the psychological disorders. A psychological disorder is also known as a mental disorder or a mental illness. And this is when, again, we're going back to abnormal behavior. It's when there's a pattern of disruptive behavior, mood, thinking, or perception that causes personal distress or impaired functioning. So again, that goes back to that criteria for abnormal behavior. It can't just be something that's unusual. That's not enough. It has to also be causing distress, impairing your function, and then it can have various disruptions in your life. And this kind of goes back to that biological model. And the way that we classify mental disorders is using something known as the DSM-5. So the DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I would focus on this. This question is very tricky on the exam because it's essentially saying what the DSM is used for, and it's mental disorders. Psychological disorders is one of the options. Don't select that one. It is for mental disorders. That's why it's the DSM, M for mental disorders. And it's essentially like a checkbook that goes through various symptoms, how long those symptoms need to be present, and then if you have a certain amount of those symptoms for the amount of time, what diagnosis you are then given, and then what sort of prescriptions you could potentially be put on, billing, things like that. And it was designed by the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA. And so that's what's used universally. If ever there is a classification of a psychological disorder, or again, to remember for the exam, a mental disorder, we use the DSM. You cannot be diagnosed with a mental disorder without going through the DSM. And so this just goes over, again, the different models of abnormal behavior. So psychodynamic, behavioral, humanistic, cognitive, all of those. And that is the end of this module. I'm going to do my best to keep these brief, though I know some of them I'm going to be covering, I think, 3 different disorders. But now that we have an idea of how it's diagnosed, now that we have an idea of what we mean by abnormal behavior, we'll be coming back for the later modules to start going into detail about some of the different disorders that are out there and how they're classified.